CNBC Meets Defining Values, brought to you by UOB Private Bank.
He's one of Australia's most progressive politicians, a Prime Minister with a conscience, fighting for social justice, battling climate change, and a champion of diplomacy. I've come to Singapore to find out what values drive the Honourable Kevin Rudd in his life, his politics, and his desire to make a difference. This is CNBC Meets Defining Values. The youngest of 4 children, Kevin Rudd grew up on a farm in rural Australia. His childhood was marked by poverty and the loss of his father. Driven by his mother's ambition and his own determination to succeed, Kevin joined the Labour Party as a teenager and went on to get a degree in Asian Studies at the Australian National University. He embraced a life in politics and became Prime Minister of Australia in 2007. The values he learned as a child defined his tenure. As Prime Minister, Kevin fought for reforms on gender equality, healthcare, education and climate change. After retiring from politics in 2013, he became the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in 2015 and works with organisations that share his values of equality and global reform. Kevin Rudd, welcome to CNBC Defining Values. Up until you were 11 years old, you lived in a rural farm in Queensland. Tell me a little bit about your childhood there and some of the experiences that shaped your later life.
Well, I grew up on a little farm. Well, in fact, it wasn't a little farm, it was a large farm. Beef property, dairy property, small crops. And my father was a share farmer. And so my mum and dad were children of the Depression. Neither of them had been to high school. Both were in the war. And after the war, they went farming after they were married. So that's where I grew up, and it was a wonderful environment to grow up in. But Dad was killed in a car accident, and so that changed our lives, and that was the end of farm life. But he did have an influence on me in this sense. I remember sitting on a horse with him one day. He was big, and his horse was big, and I was small, and my horse was tiny. And he leant over and said, "If you made up your mind about your future, the fork in the road," you're 11 years old, you have no idea what your father's talking about. He said, "No, the big choice you've got to make in your future." I said, "Dad, I don't know what you mean." He said, "No, the ultimate choice that you will need to make." I said, "Dad, what do you mean?" He said, "Is it going to be beef cattle or dairy cattle?" That's when I decided to become a diplomat.
Kevin, of course, you were just saying that your father was killed when you were 11 years old. What impact did that have on your mother, Margaret? I believe she went to retrain as a nurse and brought you and your siblings up.
Yeah, well, I was the youngest of 4, and so Mum had a responsibility then to earn an income and then to raise us. And so she did. She'd last been a nurse during the Second World War, and I'm talking about the 1970s, so she had to go back and learn from scratch. But she did, and bought a small house and raised us. And so she was a profound influence. I suppose I grew up in a single-parent family in that sense. But she taught me resilience, and she taught me hard work. And I think because of our circumstances, she instilled in me a sense of justice as well.
Did you witness many equalities in the area where you were growing up already?
Well, it was a reasonably, how do I put this delicately? It was a part of Australia, in rural Australia, where education, tertiary education, was not readily available. And so it's basically a simple farm community. But therefore, as a result, kids of great natural ability, who would normally go on to become whatever, had no such opportunities. And so you saw a lot of endemic poverty. But my mum, who had never been to high school herself much, she had this dream that I would one day go to university. I didn't know what a university was. Never been to one, hadn't met anyone who'd been to one. And so for me, that was part of her vision for where she wanted her kids to go.
What about your own vision? When did you know that you wanted to go into public office or public service?
As a kid growing up at high school, I began through my mother's influence. Mum would always give us things to read about the world, and she, for example, would give me newspaper articles about the emergence of China, and she'd say, you should read this, it's going to affect your future. And so as a result of that, I just became interested as a kid in the world. So that's what sent me off to university. I decided to do 5 years of Chinese language and history at the Australian National University. And by the time I went to university, I'd never met anyone from China. Because where I grew up, it was classic white Australia. There was nobody around. And so for me, this was a big voyage of discovery.
It must have been a huge change for you, Kevin, on all levels. But why did you decide that your focus really was on China and that was going to be your focus?
I think because I'd read and I'd been given books by Mum. I became fascinated with Chinese aesthetics, just those extraordinary roofs. If you're a kid growing up in rural Australia, there's something quite entrancing about classical Chinese architecture. And then secondly, China, as I began to read about it, was going to be a big force in the region and the world. So I felt as if I needed to understand this. But I think what my mum taught me is work out what you're passionate about, work hard with it, and do something with it for the world. Doesn't matter what your field is. But then once you graduate in the early 80s, what on earth do you do? I mean, no one in those days was employing people who had Chinese skills, maybe except the Foreign Service, which is where I ended up.
Just before that, at university, you met your wife, Therese Rain, and of course, a very formidable woman in her own right, a very successful entrepreneur. What sort of values did you share?
I think both Therese and I had come from a tradition of faith. Christianity was an important part in our respective family lives. We also had, I think, a deep interest in justice. In those days, I'd already affiliated myself with the Australian Labor Party. She had a sense of justice and equality. Her father was in a wheelchair. He'd been shot down in the war. He was a fighter pilot. And therefore, neither of us had any financial background. So we also shared a view that if we were going to get anywhere in life, it depended on these two things, our own hands.
Well, of course, you mentioned the Foreign Office, and in 1981 you joined and spent a decade living overseas, including being stationed in Stockholm and Beijing. What sort of experiences did you have there?
Well, if you're a young career diplomat and you join with reasonable Chinese language skills, then of course the natural place the Foreign Service will send you is Sweden.
Yes, exactly.
But you know, the great thing about going to our embassy in Stockholm in those days is that it was a small embassy. We covered both Norway, Sweden and Finland. And so as a young kid, I'm only 24 years old at this stage, 23, 24, just got married, like the day before we went on posting. New country, new wife, new husband, depending on your perspective, new language, new job. It's a recipe for divorce. 37 years later, we're still married. But what did we learn is that if you're in those days in a foreign country, albeit a Western country, you learn self-reliance. And secondly, in a diplomatic mission like that, which was small, you learned the entire craft. Like at the age of 24, I was chargé d'affaires, in charge of the mission for several weeks on end. So you have to run the place as well. And so you quickly learn how to handle things. I think by the time I went into politics, much later in my life, nothing ever surprised me anymore. You just learn how to deal with change.
Coming up next, Kevin Rudd makes the leap into politics.
For me, going into political life is like a duck going to water.
CNBC Meets Defining Values, brought to you by UOB Private Bank.
I'd like to donate these books. I no longer have space for them.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Where'd you get that book?
A man donated it. Dad.
Yes? I'm sorry, but I need to retrieve
I
one
don't
of...
leave you looking for this.
No, not this one. May I look in there?
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Return the book.
Welcome back to CNBC Meets Defining Values. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd used his time in office to push through major reforms on gender equality, education, climate change and healthcare. You became Prime Minister in 2007. You defeated John Howard. What was that moment like for you?
The first feeling I had was one of just deep responsibility. The elation lasted about 35 seconds, you know, like, yay. And then,
now I've got to do it.
well, I also knew enough about the economy and sufficiently financially literate to understand what was beginning to unfold in markets. And already with the emergence of subprime in the United States, I thought this is going to be a challenging time. But so it was a great sense of responsibility, as you do feel if you're elected to high office, because suddenly the hopes and aspirations of an entire nation rest on your shoulders. And the other thing, I think, about the exercise of political power is this. If you approach it soberly, the exercise of political power, in whichever country you're from, is a very sobering thing. In fact, it's a very frightening thing, because what you decide matters. It affects people's lives the next day. It's not a game, it's not a theory, it's not a plaything. And you change people's opportunities in a big way through what you decide. So for me, it was a sobering experience.
So what skills then do you call upon to have to withhold that kind of pressure and responsibility? As you say, you're changing people's lives.
First and foremost is a sense of humour. You don't have a sense of humour in political life, you die. Seriously, there's just too much going on which you can't control. And I think the second thing is, when you're looking at proposals for change in a country, be very sober about it. You don't just assume that change for its own sake is good. You've got to look at careful proposals for change, whether it's on the economy, on education or the environment, and then act. For example, the changes we brought in on climate change. We brought in a mandatory renewable energy target of 20% of Australia's energy needs by 2020 to be renewable energy. When we were elected, it was 3%. Now it's about 18%. We're nearly there. But to look at that as a decision is a complex business. You've got to read and understand where each decision takes you over 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And I think the last sort of reserve you draw upon is perseverance.
Well, of course, you pushed through a number of groundbreaking measures as Prime Ministers, including, you were just talking about climate change, ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, officially apologising to Australia's Indigenous people about the abuses that they had suffered, and also gender equality. Why were these such important issues for you, Kevin?
Well, the national apology to Aboriginal Australians, it was the right thing to do because Australian white people had treated Australian black people appallingly for 200 years. So for me, that was a basic and elemental exercise in social justice. It's a product of a reflection on who we are as human beings. Everyone's equal.
We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these, our fellow Australians.
You mentioned gender equality. If you've grown up in a family full of strong women, I had a strong mother, very strong older sister. I married a strong woman. Our first child is a very strong woman, our daughter Jessica, and she's given birth to a little girl who's Josephine, a wonderful young Chinese-Australian kid. She's 6, and by God, is she strong. For me, it is normal to be with strong women. And so I find it incomprehensible in those parts of the world where women are regarded as second-class citizens.
What more can be done, though, Kevin, do you think, around the world to close that gap for women?
You know, as I've looked around the world, I mean, there are 3 big drivers of inequality for women. One is the absence of universal health care for basic things like safe childbirth. And we're working hard on that through various development programs around the world. The second is inequality of educational opportunity, because without the tools to know where you can take yourself and your family and your community, then you can't get there. And the third is inadequate access to finance for women to be able to build their own enterprises and to build their own businesses. There's another factor as well, and that involves my gender, which is the appalling incidence of domestic violence. And violence against women is obnoxious, it's obscene, and it's criminal. When Mao said women hold up half the earth, it's not just a slogan. It actually is reflected in the reality. And we've become a better humanity as a result.
Another pivotal moment, of course, in your premiership was the financial crisis, 2007, 2008. What was it like to be a world leader at that time? And how did you know that your stimulus measures would work?
The honest answer is, for those of us who were in office at the time, it was bloody frightening, you know. I think the thing which benefited me is, by instinct, I'm an historian. I read history. I knew enough about the history of the 20s and the 30s and of the history of recent recessions in the global economy in the early 80s and the early 90s to know not just what to look for, but what measures not to adopt in response to it, like in the 30s, and the measures that you could adopt to deal with it and to lessen the blow. So when we met as a cabinet after Black Friday in October of 2008, spent the whole weekend in a cabinet meeting, brought in all the Treasury officials, and we went through the data. But we spent the first half of the first day going through economic history, what had worked before and what hadn't. And that's when we decided to act on financial confidence, provided a guarantee for all Australian savings deposits, a guarantee for all Australian interbank lending, and then began a very massive stimulus for the real economy of 5% of GDP equivalent over the next 18 months. And thank God it worked.
In 2010, that was a real roller coaster year, and there were political backstabbing, there were leadership coups. How did you keep your own moral compass during those times?
You know, I made a reasonably stern stuff, given how I was brought up, and you've been through a few tough things in your life. So you dust yourself off, and off you go again. As I said before, I'm kind of a person of faith. I am grounded in a set of deep beliefs, and therefore you enter into a zone whereby that becomes part of your resilience, that these things ultimately have a purpose, and you can work through both the highs and the lows of life.
Coming up next, Kevin Rudd talks to me about life after politics.
Everyone should have a first-class education. Everyone should have access to decent health care. What you make of your life, then, depending on your hard work or enterprise or lack thereof, that's up to you.
CNBC Meets Defining Values, brought to you by UOB Private Bank.
Good morning, Mrs. Wong.
Good morning. Your favorite.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I gotta go. Bye.
Bye.
Good morning, Mrs. Wong.
Good morning. Look what I made for you.
Thank you. Mrs. Wong? Help! Help!
Good thing your grandson was around when you had your fall, Mrs. Wong.
On the next Managing Asia, Indonesia's poster child for startup success, the man behind Gojek.
We were born out of battle. We understand exactly how to maneuver and create efficiencies. The market for payments, the market for transport, we're barely scraping the surface of how big these markets can become in the region.
Can he replicate his success overseas? An exclusive interview with Nadiem Makarim, founder of Gojek, on the next Managing Asia.
Beyond the Valley, a podcast series from CNBC. New, monthly, from the world beyond Silicon Valley. Explore the biggest tech stories. From cryptocurrencies, data and privacy, to China's tech strategy. The most prolific disruptors and entrepreneurs help you understand the stories shaping the industry's evolution. The brand new Beyond the Valley podcast from CNBC. Now available on these platforms.
Welcome back to CNBC Meets Defining Values. I'm Tanya Breyer, and I've come to Singapore to meet one of Australia's most memorable Prime Ministers, the Honourable Kevin Rudd. Kevin became Prime Minister for a second time in 2013. However, 2 months later, the Labour Party was defeated, and he announced his retirement from politics soon after. He continues to use his voice on the global stage, fighting against social injustice, inequality and climate change. You are the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. You're on a number of boards, so many different roles. But when you left public office, did you hesitate? Did you think, actually, I'm not going to do anything? Or you thought, no, I have to now get onto the global stage?
For me, it's part of a sense of vocation. It's not a job, it's what you feel you're actually called to do. And in my case, it's trying to act as some sort of intelligent, bridge where I can, and I don't overestimate the importance of this at all, between, I won't say East and West, but maybe China and the United States, where we're being ripped apart rather than being brought closer together.
With hindsight, do you think you would have gone into politics?
Oh, yes. I mean, you've got to be true to yourself. And for me, going into political life was like a duck going to water. It's what you do. So I'd always had a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. And part of that purpose for me was on the home front, because I'm a social democrat, was to try and maximize equality of opportunity for poorer people, like the person I was when I grew up. So everyone should have a first-class education. Everyone should have access to decent health care. What you make of your life, then, depending on your hard work or enterprise or lack thereof, that's up to you. But everyone should have a decent start in life. And I think the other part of my vision and mission for politics was a country like Australia, basically a bunch of white folks at the other end of the world. How do we carve out a future for a country like that in this extraordinary, dynamic, unfolding story called Asia?
I want to just take you back to the advice that you gave in your autobiography to prospective politicians, is to know what you believe in. What are the values that your beliefs give rise to?
You refer there to a course I taught at Harvard. I left the prime ministership and then chose to pursue political exile in the United States. So I went to Harvard. If you're at Harvard, you're teaching all these young kids. In the Institute of Politics, the course that I chose was called Politics and Purpose. So I said, look, what you can do at university is a few things. Number one, work out what you believe in. Two, why do you believe that? The Chinese word is xinyang. What's your xinyang? What values does that give rise to? Then, what are you passionate about doing? What really lights up your lights? And how do you put together your beliefs and your passions into a mission for life? For me, the core values which are most fundamental for me are compassion. I can't claim that that's any virtue of mine. It's just that's how my mother brought me up. If you see someone in pain, that's not a natural way to be. You must, as a human being, respond to that. Solidarity, which is, even if I don't know people in another country, I should be doing something about it. But also the freedom to choose. That's an important value. And I think on top of all those, again, what I now would describe as the ecology of the planet, which is a respect for all living things and the natural environment. And the reason I said that to the Harvard kids is, guys and girls, none of you are going to have a smooth career. None of you. There are times in life where you're going to go bang into a brick wall. Either your business is about to go bust, or the global economy is about to go bust, or your political career is about to go bust, or whatever, or you're going to get sick. And so what that requires is a resilience in life which draws its strength from essential values. And I'm fortunate enough to have imbibed many of those from my mum.
And have you instilled those same values, Kevin, to your own children and to your grandchildren, to the next generations now?
Well, I hope so. It's what we sought to do. I hope our kids, through having grown up with us and been in political life, lived in prime ministerial residences, been on the most fantastic family holidays in Europe, but also been in a tent down the beach with their father cooking for them badly, that the values I spoke about before of a natural empathy, a natural compassion, a natural sense of solidarity, but a passion about freedom and respect for others, I hope that they take root as well, and with our little ones as well, 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. Life's a wonderful thing, and I hope, however long I live, I've been able to make some difference to improve people's conditions in life.
Kevin Rudd, thank you so much for joining us on CNBC Meets Defining Values.
Good, thank you.
CNBC Meets Defining Values, brought to you by UOB Private Bank.
It's not a question of place. It's not a question of temperature. It's not a question of dedication. In fact, it's not a question at all.
Energy has to be better. It's our responsibility.
And our commitment to make it better.
For all of us.
Total, committed to better energy.
Fallon has the Trump News Network.
On to some lighter news. I might start a war with Iran.
And from NBC's Making It, Amy Poehler with Think Fast.
How do you dance?
It's like this. This weekend.
Delivering Alpha is the #1 investment event for people in